In the summer of 1883, federal investigators arrived at a place known to locals as the Garden of Eden. It was a Christian community in southwestern Kansas that had been mysteriously abandoned overnight. What they found beneath the flower beds would haunt them forever. Over 11 years, 9 families had vanished without a trace, their leaders claiming they had left for missionary work. But investigators uncovered skeletal remains in mass graves, their life savings stolen. The New Eden Christian community wasn't a sanctuary. It was a killing field. Before we continue with the story of Prophet Isaiah Richardson and his family of killers, know that this content is only for the bravest souls who dare to uncover the truth behind America's most disturbing mysteries. If you're brave enough to hear stories that few dare to tell, subscribe now and tell us in the comments where you're listening from. This story will make you question everything you thought you knew about faith and trust. What happened over those 11 years on the Kansas prairie would become one of the most systematically concealed crimes in American history. And tonight, you'll learn why the federal government wanted this story to disappear forever. The year was 1871, and the Kansas frontier was still raw with possibility and danger. 60 miles southwest lay Dodge City, a lawless cattle town where gunshots punctuated Saturday nights like church bells on Sunday mornings. But 30 miles northeast of Dodge, in a fertile valley where Crooked Creek meandered through endless grassland, a different kind of settlement was taking root. The New Eden Christian community occupied nearly 2,000 acres of prime farmland, purchased with what appeared to be substantial Eastern investment. Unlike the rough-hewn homesteads scattered across the prairie, New Eden boasted impressive wooden structures, a grand meeting hall with stained glass windows shipped from Chicago, multiple dormitory buildings that could house dozens of families, workshops for blacksmithing and carpentry, and most striking of all, the Prophet's house, a 3-story Victorian mansion that seemed impossibly grand for the Kansas wilderness. Prophet Isaiah Richardson had arrived in Kansas in the spring of 1871 with his wife, Elder Sarah Richardson, and their 23-year-old son, Joshua. Isaiah was a tall, commanding figure with steel-gray hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to see straight through to a person's soul. His voice carried the authority of someone who had communed with the divine, deep and resonant, capable of making grown men weep with conviction or tremble with fear. Sarah, his wife of 26 years, possessed a different kind of power, the quiet, watchful intelligence of someone who noticed everything and forgot nothing. She managed the community's daily operations with an efficiency that bordered on supernatural. Joshua, their son, combined his father's physical presence with his mother's calculating mind, serving as the community's enforcer and the one who welcomed new families to their promised land. The Richardson family preached a unique doctrine they called divine simplicity, the belief that true Christians should abandon worldly possessions and live in communal harmony, sharing all resources for the greater glory of God. They promised arriving families a life free from the struggles of frontier existence, no more failed crops, no more fear of raids, no more winter starvation. In exchange, families would contribute their worldly goods to the community treasury and submit to the spiritual guidance of Prophet Isaiah. By the end of 1871, 14 families had joined. By 1872, there were 28. By 1874, New Eden had reached a stable population of 35 families, approximately 175 men, women, and children living in what appeared to be perfect Christian harmony. Each family brought their life savings, their livestock, their tools, and most importantly, their unquestioning faith in Prophet Isaiah's divine mission. The community thrived with remarkable prosperity. Gardens yielded vegetables in abundance despite the harsh Kansas climate. Workshops produced furniture and tools of exceptional quality that were sold in distant markets. Children attended school 6 days a week, learning not just reading and arithmetic, but also music and art. Evening meals in the Great Hall were times of fellowship and spiritual instruction, with Prophet Isaiah delivering sermons that spoke to the deepest longings of the human heart. But there were rules in New Eden, rules that newcomers learned gradually. All correspondence with the outside world had to be approved by Elder Sarah. Visits from relatives or friends were discouraged, they might bring worldly influences that could corrupt the community's spiritual purity. Most importantly, once families committed their worldly goods to the community treasury, leaving became complicated. Prophet Isaiah explained that God had shown him visions of families who tried to leave, terrible visions of failure, death, and damnation awaited those who turned their backs on a divine calling. What visitors didn't see were the closed-door meetings between the Richardson family, always held in the prophet's house after the evening meal. They didn't notice how certain families seemed to struggle with doubt or discontent, asking uncomfortable questions about community finances or challenging the absolute authority Prophet Isaiah claimed to possess. Most importantly, they didn't realize that the beautiful garden surrounding the meeting hall, gardens that Elder Sarah tended with devoted care, would eventually hold secrets that would shatter their faith in humanity forever. The Richardson family had not come to Kansas to build a Christian community. They had come to perfect a system that would make them wealthy beyond their wildest dreams, all while hiding their crimes behind the unassailable walls of religious devotion. The first murder happened on a bitter February night in 1872, exactly 10 months after the Miller family had arrived at New Eden. But to understand the true horror of what occurred, we must first understand how carefully the Richardson family had planned every detail of their unholy enterprise. Herman Miller had been growing restless. The promised education for his children consisted mainly of memorizing biblical passages and learning trades that seemed designed to benefit the community rather than prepare them for independent lives. More troubling, Herman had begun to question the community's finances. He had contributed $400 in valuable livestock to the treasury, yet when he asked Elder Sarah about purchasing winter clothing for his children, she told him the community couldn't afford such luxuries. That February evening, Herman approached Prophet Isaiah after the community's dinner. Other families were settling into their evening routines, unaware they were about to witness the beginning of a pattern that would claim 9 families over the next 11 years. "Brother Isaiah," Herman said, his voice tight with frustration, "I've been thinking about our family's contribution. That's more than some men see in 5 years. Yet we can't afford winter coats for the children." Prophet Isaiah's reaction was swift and calculated. His blue eyes flashed with what appeared to be righteous anger, but Joshua Richardson, watching from across the hall, recognized it as something else entirely, the cold fury of a predator whose prey had just revealed dangerous intelligence. The confrontation escalated, with Herman growing more insistent about accountability and Isaiah becoming more dramatically offended by what he called worldly thinking. Finally, Prophet Isaiah raised his hand for silence. "Brother Herman, I can see the devil has been whispering doubts in your ear. Come to my house after evening prayers, and we'll seek divine guidance together." At 10 that night, Herman Miller walked through the snow to the prophet's house, expecting a private discussion. Joshua met him at the door, explaining his father was waiting in the study, a comfortable room lined with religious books and warmed by a large fireplace. What happened next would be repeated with minor variations 8 more times over the following decade. "Brother Herman," Isaiah began, his voice gentle, "I understand your worries. But God has shown me something remarkable about your family's future, a special mission that will bring great glory to his name." As Isaiah spoke, Herman noticed Joshua had entered and was standing behind him. Something in the younger man's posture made Herman uneasy, but before he could turn completely, Joshua's powerful hands were around his throat. The struggle was brief but violent. Herman was strong, hardened by frontier life, but no match for Joshua's calculated brutality. Within minutes, Herman's body lay still on the study floor, his neck broken with professional efficiency. They had practiced this technique before coming to Kansas, perfecting their method of killing without leaving obvious wounds or excessive blood. While Joshua disposed of the body in a specially prepared pit behind the house, Isaiah and Sarah went to the Miller family's quarters. They woke Ruth Miller with gentle voices, explaining Herman had suffered a heart attack during prayer and passed peacefully into God's arms. 3 days after the murder, the Miller family supposedly departed for California before dawn. Prophet Isaiah explained Ruth had received a divine vision calling them to missionary work among gold miners, and that Joshua had escorted them to the railroad station in Dodge City. Of course, the Miller family never left New Eden alive. That cold February morning, Ruth Miller and her 4 children joined Herman in what would become Elder Sarah's memorial garden. Their deaths were swift, poison in their morning coffee, administered by Elder Sarah with the same gentle care she showed in all her duties. By the time the rest of New Eden awakened, the Miller family's belongings had been sorted and stored. Their valuable items would be sold in distant towns, their life savings added to the Richardson family's growing treasury, and their bodies buried in what Elder Sarah would designate as the community's first memorial garden, a beautiful flower bed where the faithful could remember departed loved ones and pray for missionaries in distant lands. The other families mourned the Millers' departure and prayed for their success. They had no idea they were praying over their graves. The months following established a pattern that would become terrifyingly routine. The community entered a period of mourning, with Prophet Isaiah delivering increasingly powerful sermons about sacrifice and divine calling. The remaining families drew closer together, finding comfort in shared faith and trust in the Richardson family's guidance. The beauty of their system was its careful pacing. Eliminating families too frequently would create suspicion, so they spaced their activities strategically. They focused on recruiting new families, managing legitimate prosperity, and identifying their next victims through careful psychological observation. New families continued to arrive with remarkable regularity throughout 1872 and 1873, drawn by stories of New Eden's success spreading through church networks. The community maintained its stable population of 35 families, with new arrivals replacing those called to service. Thomas Hartwell and his family arrived from Ohio in the spring of 1873, bringing substantial savings and 2 teenage sons skilled as craftsmen. Thomas had been a schoolteacher, and his intellectual curiosity made him valuable for managing educational programs. But by autumn, he had begun asking uncomfortable questions about record-keeping and financial accountability. On November 15, 1873, Thomas Hartwell suffered a sudden illness during evening prayers, collapsing in the meeting hall before falling still. Elder Sarah, with extensive knowledge of medicinal plants, had added a measured dose of water hemlock to his evening tea. The community mourned, and Prophet Isaiah announced another divine vision. God had called Thomas's widow, Mary, and their sons to missionary work among Scandinavian immigrants in Minnesota Territory. 3 days after the funeral, the surviving Hartwells supposedly departed for their new mission. Like the Millers, they never left New Eden alive. Their bodies joined the growing collection in the memorial garden, their worldly goods added to the treasury, their deaths explained by divine mission. The Kowalski family arrived from Illinois in 1874, Polish immigrants with valuable metalwork skills. But Stefan Kowalski possessed an old-world skepticism about religious authority that made him question Prophet Isaiah's control. In February 1875, the family perished in a tragic accident when their quarters caught fire during a winter storm. According to Joshua's tearful account, he had tried to rescue them, but the fire spread too quickly. Elder Peterson joined in 1875, bringing his family and substantial banking experience useful for managing finances. But by early 1876, he noticed discrepancies between the community's supposed poverty and its actual expenditures. During a severe prairie storm in May 1876, Elder Peterson was struck by lightning while working in the fields. His widow and daughter soon received a divine calling to missionary work among railroad crews in Colorado. Each elimination taught new lessons about refining their methods. They learned to vary their techniques, sometimes accidents, sometimes illness, sometimes divine calling. They discovered that maintaining detailed records of victims' assets, while dangerous, was necessary for converting stolen property into wealth through sales in distant markets. By the end of 1876, 4 families had been eliminated, and the private treasury contained nearly $50,000 in cash plus valuable property. More importantly, they had perfected their system of identifying problematic families, manipulating religious devotion to maintain control, and eliminating threats while preserving their reputation as devoted Christian leaders. The vast majority of families lived peaceful, productive lives for years, seeing only apparent devotion, material prosperity, and inspiring examples of faithful families accepting God's calling. When letters arrived asking about missing relatives, Elder Sarah's responses were masterpieces of religious rhetoric. When officials inquired about land or taxes, Prophet Isaiah's documentation was meticulous and his compliance flawless. The years 1877 through 1880 marked increasing confidence but also growing danger as success attracted unwanted attention. They had eliminated 4 families without suspicion, accumulated substantial wealth, and established New Eden as one of the most prosperous religious communities on the frontier. But boldness led them into risks that would ultimately expose their crimes. The Brennan family arrived from Missouri in April 1877, fleeing debts. Patrick Brennan was an Irish Catholic convert whose religious transition had alienated him from his family. They brought 6 children and nearly $700 in savings. Patrick possessed one fatal quality: he was a natural investigator. His background taught him wariness of religious authority, and his financial ruin made him skeptical of promises that seemed too good to be true. By winter, Patrick began asking uncomfortable questions about families who had supposedly departed. "Brother Isaiah," he said one evening, "I've never received a single letter from any of them, despite writing several. Don't missionaries usually maintain correspondence?" Prophet Isaiah's response was immediate: "Brother Patrick, I'm troubled by your lack of faith. We must trust they are fulfilling God's will." But Patrick's questions grew more specific. Why did departures always happen suddenly? Why were destinations vague? Why were there no records of missionary activities? Their solution was audacious. In March 1878, they staged a miraculous divine intervention. During evening prayers, Prophet Isaiah collapsed, writhing in apparent supernatural agony. After an hour, he rose, face radiant, and announced God had shown him a vision. Satan had sent agents to infiltrate the community, and Patrick Brennan was the primary agent. Patrick faced a choice: submit completely or be expelled. His wife Margaret, terrified by the display, begged him to apologize. Patrick's capitulation was complete. He publicly confessed his sins, admitted Satan had corrupted his thoughts, and pledged absolute obedience. But the Richardson family had no intention of letting him live. His questions were too intelligent, his skepticism too dangerous. On April 20, 1878, Patrick Brennan died in his sleep, apparently of a heart attack from spiritual stress. Margaret and her 6 children, devastated and convinced his doubts caused divine punishment, readily accepted Prophet Isaiah's revelation. They were called to missionary work among Irish immigrants in Colorado mining camps. Their departure followed the established pattern, providing the largest single haul of assets, $700 in cash plus valuable property. 2 more families fell victim between 1879 and 1881. The Schmidt family, German immigrants who questioned the community's lack of contact with Lutheran churches, died in a food poisoning incident that affected only their household. The Caldwell family met their end in 1881 when Patriarch William Caldwell's drinking problem led him to make indiscreet comments about missing families. But the Caldwell elimination would ultimately bring down the enterprise because it included a victim too young to be manipulated and too intelligent to accept explanations: 16-year-old Emma Caldwell. She had grown up on the frontier, where children learned early to observe adult behavior. Her investigation began after her mother's natural death in late 1880. She noticed Elder Sarah ask specific questions about her mother's family back east. Did they write regularly? Would they expect to hear from them? How much did they know about their plans? When helping sort her mother's belongings, Emma noticed Elder Sarah set aside all correspondence and family records. "These will be important when God calls your family to missionary service," Elder Sarah said, as if such a calling was already determined. Emma began paying attention to patterns. She realized families chosen for elimination were always those who questioned policies or possessed profitable resources. More disturbing was her discovery of a hidden storage room beneath the prophet's house containing personal belongings from families who had supposedly departed but left behind precious possessions. In January 1881, Emma made a desperate decision. She wrote detailed letters describing her observations, addressing them to the sheriff in Dodge City, the federal marshal in Wichita, and her uncle in Illinois. But before she could mail them, Elder Sarah discovered her activities. The Caldwell elimination in February followed the pattern, but Emma's attempt planted the first seeds of fear in the Richardson family. For the first time, they faced the possibility their crimes might be discovered. Emma's death was necessary, but her final words, shouted as Joshua cornered her, would haunt Elder Sarah. "I wrote 3 letters. They're already mailed. Everyone will know." Emma had been lying. The letters were still hidden, but her bluff planted genuine fear. This led to decisions that would expose their crimes. First, they decided to accelerate their timeline for leaving Kansas, planning to liquidate assets and relocate to California. Second, they began eliminating evidence more aggressively, burning documents and items they had preserved as trophies. Most fatally, they decided to eliminate one final family before departure, the Hoffmans, recent German immigrants with substantial savings and knowledge of banking systems useful for establishing new identities. But the Hoffman elimination in June 1882 differed because it was motivated by greed rather than necessity and planned hastily. Klaus Hoffmann had been a successful merchant in Prussia, selling his business for a substantial sum in American currency and bonds. His arrival represented the largest financial opportunity they had ever encountered. But Klaus was also the most sophisticated victim. His banking experience made him suspicious of New Eden's financial arrangements, and his connections meant his disappearance would likely trigger investigation. Their desperation led them to abandon usual patience, acting within weeks of his arrival. This haste led to their first serious operational error in a decade. On the night of June 15, 1882, they attempted to eliminate Klaus using their standard technique. But Klaus was suspicious and had told his wife Greta to expect his return by midnight and to alert others if he failed to appear. When Joshua attempted to overpower him, he encountered unexpected resistance. Klaus was younger, stronger, and prepared. The struggle was loud and prolonged, creating noise that could be heard throughout the house. Worse, Klaus wounded Joshua with a letter opener, creating a blood trail and obvious signs of violence. For the first time, they faced explaining evidence of murder to awakened community members. Their solution was audacious but self-destructive. Prophet Isaiah announced the next morning that Klaus had been possessed by demonic forces, requiring a violent exorcism that resulted in his peaceful death. This explanation satisfied traumatized members but created the first cracks in their reputation. Greta and her children, devastated and terrified, accepted Prophet Isaiah's revelation. They were called to return to Germany as missionaries. Their departure was scheduled for early July. But the Hoffman family never left Kansas alive. Their elimination on July 3, 1882, was witnessed by someone they had never considered a threat, 8-year-old Timothy Weber, who had been hiding in the barn during hide-and-seek. Timothy saw Joshua loading bodies into a wagon and heard Elder Sarah giving burial instructions. He was too young to understand fully but old enough to realize the Hoffmans hadn't departed for Germany. Timothy's innocent questions to his parents created the first serious crack in control. When his father, Elder Weber, approached Prophet Isaiah with the report, he received strained explanations. For the first time in 11 years, a member began seriously questioning official explanations. Elder Weber's suspicions and Timothy's eyewitness account created an internal threat they had never faced. Just as everything comes to a head in this terrifying tale, I want to pause. If this story is giving you chills, share it with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit like to support our content, and subscribe to never miss stories like this. The truth about what happened next is even more shocking. Let's discover together how this house of horrors finally came crashing down. The investigation began not with law enforcement but with a persistent mother named Catherine Brennan McKenna, Patrick Brennan's older sister in St. Louis. Her husband, Michael, was a federal customs inspector. Unlike most relatives, Catherine had resources and connections to pursue a thorough investigation. She had been troubled by the complete lack of communication since her brother's supposed departure in 1878. Patrick had been a faithful correspondent, and his silence was out of character. In spring 1882, Catherine convinced Michael to use his connections to make official inquiries. He contacted federal agents in Colorado, railroad companies, and missionary organizations. No record existed of any Brennan family engaging in missionary work. Armed with this, Catherine and Michael traveled to Kansas in August 1882, determined to visit New Eden unannounced. During 3 days of reconnaissance, they observed a community that seemed prosperous but strangely tense. They saw well-maintained buildings and expensive equipment suggesting financial resources inconsistent with a struggling settlement. More disturbing were behavioral patterns. During evening gatherings, people demonstrated frantic enthusiasm as if performing devotion. Children appeared subdued and watchful. Most significantly, they witnessed Elder Weber approaching Prophet Isaiah with urgent concerns, accompanied by young Timothy. The conversation was agitated, with Isaiah showing anxiety. That evening, Catherine and Michael approached openly, demanding to speak about Patrick's family. Their arrival created a stir. Prophet Isaiah met them in the meeting hall, flanked by Sarah and Joshua. He explained the Brennans were doing missionary work in Colorado and produced supposed letters from Patrick. But Catherine recognized the handwriting and style as forgeries. The letters contained geographical references she knew were incorrect. "These were not written by my brother," she stated. Patrick would never describe the Colorado Rockies as having gentle valleys. He served there during the war and knew they were harsh. The confrontation revealed cracks in the facade. Prophet Isaiah's authority meant nothing to Catherine, raised Irish Catholic. Michael's federal credentials made it impossible to dismiss them. Their intention to report to authorities meant the Richardsons couldn't simply make them disappear. The breakthrough came when Michael began asking specific questions about legal status and financial operations. How was land ownership documented? What records existed of property transfers? Where were tax records? Prophet Isaiah's responses were evasive. Finances were managed through divine guidance, documentation was unnecessary, tax obligations were handled through special arrangements. These answers confirmed Michael's suspicions of criminal activity. But it was Timothy Weber who provided conclusive evidence. During the discussion, Timothy whispered to his father, making Elder Weber pale. Timothy had seen the Hoffmans' burial, contradicting the story of their departure. His questions led Elder Weber to examine the garden, revealing inconsistencies in soil and flower arrangements suggesting systematic burials. That night, Catherine and Michael departed for Dodge City to request an official investigation. They carried Timothy's testimony, Elder Weber's observations, and evidence of financial fraud. The Richardson family watched them leave with panic, realizing their system faced its most serious threat. The federal investigation began on September 10, 1882, when Deputy U.S. Marshal James Crawford arrived with warrants to examine records and interview residents about missing persons reports. He was accompanied by a territorial attorney, a land office inspector, and deputy sheriffs. They brought legal authority that transcended religious claims. What investigators found was a community in controlled panic. The Richardsons had spent weeks preparing, coaching members and destroying evidence. But they had made a fatal error. Overconfidence led them to keep detailed records of victims' property, believing they proved legitimate transactions rather than murder. Marshal Crawford's discovery of the hidden vault was anticlimactic. After hours of examination, the vault contained personal belongings from 9 families, photographs, Bibles, toys, wedding rings, and identity documents proving they never left alive. The physical evidence that broke the case was Elder Sarah's memorial garden. Excavation based on Timothy's testimony uncovered a carefully organized cemetery with 47 remains buried in family groups with personal possessions. The arrests were swift. Prophet Isaiah, Elder Sarah, and Joshua were charged with 9 counts of first-degree murder, plus fraud, theft, and conspiracy. Surviving members, traumatized by the revelation they had lived above a mass grave, provided testimony painting a horrifying picture of manipulation and murder. The trial became one of the most sensational in Kansas territorial history, attracting national coverage and sparking congressional debates. Prosecution built its case around 3 categories: physical proof from the garden, documentary evidence from the vault, and testimony from survivors about psychological manipulation. Physical evidence was overwhelming. Coroner's exams revealed a consistent pattern. Men showed signs of strangulation or blunt force trauma. Women and children exhibited poisoning with traces of water hemlock and other toxins Elder Sarah had cultivated. Documentary evidence showed meticulous records of victims' assets, revealing accumulation of over $150,000 in cash and convertible assets, a fortune worth millions today. Most damaging was survivor testimony, particularly Elder Weber and Timothy. "We trusted them completely," Elder Weber said, voice breaking. "When families vanished, we accepted explanations because we believed Prophet Isaiah spoke with God's voice. We were told doubt was the devil's work. We were fools, and our foolishness cost lives." Defense argued the Richardsons were legally insane from religious delusions, but this collapsed when prosecutors revealed the meticulous planning. Prophet Isaiah's own testimony was the final nail. Convinced of divine authority, he attempted to justify actions by claiming God revealed which families were worthy of salvation and which destined for destruction. His lack of remorse and detailed knowledge demonstrated premeditation, making the death penalty inevitable. The jury deliberated less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. All three were sentenced to death by hanging, scheduled for November 15, 1882, exactly 9 years after Thomas Hartwell became their second victim. Executions were carried out simultaneously on 3 gallows in Dodge City, witnessed by nearly 1,500 people. Newspapers reported all three maintained claims of divine authority, with prophet Isaiah's final words predicting God would vindicate them. Aftermath had profound implications. The federal government implemented new oversight for isolated religious communities, mandating regular inspections and financial audits. Congressional investigators used the case for stronger territorial law enforcement, expanding marshal services and improving communication for tracking missing persons. Survivors faced rebuilding lives after psychological trauma. Most returned home, aided by federal compensation from sale of stolen assets. Several required ongoing care for what physicians called nervous exhaustion, now recognized as severe PTSD. Catherine Brennan McKenna became a celebrated figure, advocating for improved oversight and protection for families in isolated settlements. Her efforts contributed to legislation requiring authorities to maintain contact with religious communities and investigate missing persons reports. The site of New Eden was abandoned, declared unsuitable for settlement. Local folklore claimed it was cursed. Attempts to establish new settlements failed. Buildings fell into ruin, and by the early 1900s, only foundation stones and gardens remained. Modern historians consider it one of the most sophisticated criminal enterprises of the 19th century, remarkable for scope, duration, and psychological techniques. Criminal psychologists identify it as an early example of organized crime disguised as religious authority. The story serves as a chilling reminder of how devotion can be manipulated by those who understand human psychology and exploit needs for community and spiritual guidance. It shows how isolation and authority can control victims so completely they participate in their own destruction, believing they serve a divine purpose. Perhaps most disturbing, it reveals how easily a community becomes complicit in systematic evil when presented as religious duty. The families who died were not naive, they were faithful Christians seeking a better life, whose trust was weaponized against them. The 9 families, the Millers, Hartwells, Kowalskis, Petersons, Brennans, Hoffmans, Schmidts, Caldwells, and one whose name was lost, represent the ultimate betrayal of faith, the corruption of religious community, and the terrible price paid when absolute power meets absolute evil in isolated spaces. This mystery shows the greatest evil often comes not from obvious monsters, but from those who present themselves as servants of light while serving only their own dark appetites for power and wealth.